Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
The year is 1877, and trouble is brewing in the great Southwest. The natives are restless. The cavalry is anxious. The miners are thirsty. The temperance ladies are up in arms. Why? Because 40 wagons full of whiskey are heading west along the Hallelujah Trail. And so are Burt Lancaster, the cool colonel, Lee Remick, the hot-tempered temperance lady.
And if we are to respect man, then we must save man from himself and from the poison of alcoholic spirits.
Donald Pleasance, the unpredictable oracle.
The chief says he wants 20 wagons of crazy water.
20 wagons of whiskey?
That chief, he's a real boozer, Colonel.
And when they meet, all Hallelujah breaks loose along the Hallelujah Trail.
That was the trailer to director John Sturgis's The Hallelujah Trail, an all-star Western satire made in 1965. And on this hilarious episode of How the West Was Cast, our topic is comedy westerns. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, Andrew, before we each present our three choices for comedy westerns, why don't you share some thoughts about the subject of today's episode?
One common idea about how movie genres change over time is that as a genre begins to wane, comedic renditions of its familiar stories become more common. When audiences begin to take a particular genre less seriously, and it consequently loses its hold on the popular culture, this theory goes, filmmakers respond by playing to those sensibilities, producing movies that lampoon rather than uphold convention. I referenced an example of this theory in our October 2020 episode on horror westerns, when I said that many critics of the horror movie have noted that the monsters that so terrified audiences of the 30s, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, and so on, had, by the end of the 40s, been reduced to jokes, a transformation exemplified by the smash success of the spoof Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948. A similar argument is often made about the Western, with the Mel Brooks parody Blazing Saddles as the movie that hammered the final nail in the Western's coffin. Blazing Saddles was not just a hit, it was the second highest earning film of 1974, just behind The Towering Inferno, and remained the highest earning Western of all time until the 1990s. Nearly 40 years after its release, Blazing Saddles is, for many, still the quintessential Western comedy, much to the chagrin of some Western fans. Evolutionary accounts of how movie genres develop over time are appealing, mainly because they are simple and invoke patterns that are familiar to us, like going from birth to death. The actual history of the Western, or the horror movie, or any type of film, is, of course, more complicated, and comedies can and do appear at any point in a genre's history. For as long as there have been movies about cowboys in the Old West, there have been movies that made fun of cowboys and the Old West. Edwin S. Porter's 1903 film The Great Train Robbery was not the first Western, and was not even a Western at all, because neither the people making it nor those watching it thought of it as such. But it was a very popular movie about outlaws in the American West, and it was followed, 2 years later, by a parody, The Little Train Robbery, about child bandits robbing candy and toys from a miniature railcar. In the 1920s, Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and Harold Lloyd made celebrated films set in the Old West. The Marx Brothers, the Three Stooges, Bob Hope, and Jerry Lewis starred in Western comedies in the 40s and 50s. Many of the major comic actors of the past 40 years have taken a crack at the Western. Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, Martin Short, John Candy, Billy Crystal, Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, Seth MacFarlane. Just as the Western has perennially appealed to many of our greatest filmmakers and actors, so has it appealed to many of our greatest comedians, or at least most popular comedians. That's not to say other actors always took the genre seriously. John Wayne, Gene Autry, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, Burt Lancaster, Henry Fonda, and Clint Eastwood also all made comedic westerns, some of which are among their most fondly remembered efforts in the genre. If the ability to laugh at oneself is, indeed, a measure of strength, then the glorious history of Western comedies is yet more evidence of the genre's greatness.
So for this episode, we've each selected 3 comedy westerns that we think are well worth recommending. However, we've decided not to include Blazing Saddles as one of our choices. And the reason for that is, well, it's just too obvious of a selection. So instead, we're focusing on films that don't get as much attention and could maybe use an extra boost. So, Andrew, what's your first choice for comedy western?
My first film is Go West, released in 1925, directed by and starring the great Buster Keaton. Recalling Horace Greeley's famous directive, "Go west, young man, go west," our friendless hero, appropriately named Friendless, places pocket pistol in pocket and stows away in an Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railcar, eventually finding work on an Arizona ranch. In contrast to the work of rival comedians of the mature silent period, Keaton's features consistently subvert the romantic conventions and expectations of the form, a trait that arguably reached its apogee in Go West. Putting the cow in cowboy, the story focuses not on a budding romance between Friendless and the ranch owner's daughter, but on the friendship between the clumsy cowhand and an equally ostracized cow named Brown Eyes. Keaton spent 10 days training the cow, and the results are hilarious, as Brown Eyes behaves more canine than bovine. In the picture's final act, it falls to Friendless to thwart an attempt by a rival rancher to stop his boss's beeves from getting to market, leading to an elaborate extended sequence where our hero herds 300 cattle through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, past automobiles, traffic cops, Turkish baths, and terrified onlookers. It's a sequence that, at least in scale, rivals anything that Keaton or his peers attempted. Friendless's final act of range-hand heroism earns him the boss's respect and saves Brown Eyes from the slaughterhouse. Go West is not among Keaton's best-known films, or among his best-loved films, maybe because of how he pushes his customary skewering of screen sentimentality to the limit. But as a silent send-up of the already familiar tropes of cowboy pictures, it's delightful. And also, I should add, a good reminder that the incongruities between cowboys and modern life were serving as fodder for screen drama well before 1960s efforts like Lonely Are the Brave or Midnight Cowboy. Keaton had, of course, explored familiar Western-type stories before, in, for example, Our Hospitality in 1923, which parodies the Hatfield-McCoy feud, and he'd do so again in the Civil War comedy The General in 1926. But those are stories for another day.
I'm so glad you picked this movie as one of your choices because I hadn't seen it since high school. It had been a long time. And what a refreshing change of pace this was after watching so many other Westerns over these last year in prep for this show. It's so nice to see such a beautifully composed film. It's not a million cuts a minute. It really takes its time. It almost looks like a graphic novel come to life. The images are so clearly defined. Each one is just so beautiful. I watched a 2018 restoration of it in prep for this episode. It's available to rent on YouTube if listeners haven't seen it in a while. Definitely the way to go. As you said, the cow relationship. I'll take a relationship between a cowboy and a cow over a relationship between a cowboy and just some woman that's supposed to be his love of his life or something. That is always the most boring part of the film. Here, this interspecies friendship that we see is really delightful. It also makes me wonder why we haven't seen more cow characters in films. I know Kelly Reichardt has First Cow, where the cow is very central to the film. The only other ones I can remember are Roseanne Barr did a voice of a cow in Home on the Range. She's the main character as an animated
Disney film,
cow.
Yeah.
And of course, Norman the calf in City Slickers.
Yes.
Who Brown Eyes really reminds me of. The relationship. In fact, City Slickers seems to take a lot from this film in that here's the city guy showing up at the Dude Ranch, or not a Dude Ranch in this film, but in City Slickers. I think there's definitely a inspiration there.
Yeah, I think that, City Slickers out west theme is kind of evergreen in some ways, as this film demonstrates. The other notable screen bovine that I might point to is the cow Vindicator in The Rare Breed, which is a Jimmy Stewart, Maureen O'Hara Western from the late 1960s that Andy V. McLaughlin directed. You're right, though, that we get a lot of famous horses in Westerns, but relationships with cows are few and far between. A year into this podcast, I had begun to get a little bit self-conscious that we hadn't done any silent films yet, given that there's nearly 30 years worth of silent films about cowboys and so on. And I feel really good about this being the first choice. Obviously, it would be great at one point to get to The Covered Wagon or The Iron Horse or The Vanishing American or what have you. But this is just a really enjoyable film that I do think shows off Keaton's familiarity with the Western and his ability to really ring it for comedic effect.
He was on fire during this period. There were so many great movies he was making. So many of his biggest films within this 5-year period, a little bit before and a little bit after.
Yeah, I think it's someone like Roger Ebert or David Thompson who's made the claim that when you look at Keaton's body of work during this period, not only Go West or some of the other films that I mentioned, Our Hospitality, The General, you've got Steamboat Bill Jr., Sherlock Jr. I mean, it does really go on and on, that there's a case to be made that this is really the greatest moment in the career of arguably the greatest director star in the history of cinema.
Now, Chaplin, did he do any Westerns, or is he just always the little tramp, so we don't get a Western character?
Well, The Gold Rush is arguably a Western story because it does take place on the frontier. Obviously, it's not the frontier that we associate with cowboys and Indians necessarily, but the Western has no shortage of Gold Rush type stories. So you could even make the case that what some consider to be Chaplin's greatest film, or certainly the film that really distinguished him as a filmmaker, is also him, a comedian making use of conventional Western subject matter.
Some of the visual gags we get in this movie are so wonderful. The rope ladder that he uses to climb up on his oversized horse is great. The camera mounted on the back of an artificial bull that we see the horns as it's charging towards him. And anytime movies use artificial animals that we're not supposed to know aren't fake animals, like when you see cowboys riding on an obviously phony horse, I love those details. And this one has some great ones.
There's that really great recurring bit of Keaton playing Matador to attract bulls. And the sign of a good comedian and also a good film is when something isn't just used once, it's actually used in repeated fashion. And Keaton finds a way to up the stakes of this Matador bit, going from a simple kerchief at the start to an elaborate Red Devil costume at the end, running down the streets, bringing policemen and 300 head of cattle with him.
Well, I know at least 2 of the films that are coming up on the show have repeated gags that play out over the course of the film and pay off by the end of it. So we'll have to be on the lookout for those.
All right, Matt, what's your first film for today?
My first choice is the 1963 John Wayne comedy, MCLINTOCK, or more accurately, McClintock. That's because, of course, there's an exclamation point in the title of the movie, which puts McClintock in good company with comedies like Airplane, Mamma Mia, and Disney's That Darn Cat, all of which punctuated their titles in the same silly way. Set in the 1890s against the backdrop of the Mesa Verde, the film casts Wayne as George Washington McClintock, a wealthy cattle rancher whose hot-blooded wife, Catherine, has left him for some unknown reason. When McClintock's teenage daughter Becky comes home from college and begins courting the goofy son of a local politician, her arrival sets in motion a string of complications involving homesteaders, Indian rights, and the return of McClintock's estranged spouse, who wants Becky to come live with her. Made by Wayne's production company Batjack to help recoup some of the financial losses incurred by the Alamo, the film co-stars a bounty of familiar Western faces like Chill Wills, Hank Worden, and Michael Pate. It's also a bit of a family affair for Wayne. The actor's oldest son Michael produced the film, and his son Patrick has a juicy role in it, playing Dev Warren, a hard-working farmer who takes a shine to Becky. Wayne's daughter Aisa also has a small role here, playing Dev's young sister. McClintock is best remembered, however, for being the fourth of 5 movies pairing Wayne with actress Maureen O'Hara. She plays the fiery Catherine, and the lively sparring between Mr. and Mrs. McClintock provides the film with some of its funniest moments. Loosely inspired by Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, the film's script was written by James Edward Grant, who we discussed at length in our Hondo episode. Once again, Grant proves that no other writer was better at capturing Wayne's unique voice than he was. But what's interesting about the script for McClintock is that it's not filled with jokes or puns. Instead, the laughs often come from Wayne's offhand remarks and grumpy asides. Although it does have a bit of slapstick humor punctuated by the usual wacky sound effects, most notably in the elaborate mud pit fight, the film isn't as broad as North to Alaska, which was released 3 years earlier. Rather, it's a domestic comedy about a married couple who just can't live with or without each other. Now, I have to admit, I love a good movie grouch, whether it's Charles Grodin in the Beethoven dog movies or Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino. Give me a cantankerous old coot complaining about how annoying everything is around him, and I'm a pretty happy camper. So that might explain why McClintock is one of my favorite John Wayne characters. I just find his exasperation and his short-fused temper endlessly amusing. He sets the tone right away from his very first line of dialogue that goes,
"Don't say it's a fine morning or I'll shoot you."
Time and time again throughout the film, Wayne's testy attitude and surly behavior just crack me up. Now, as much as I enjoy McClintock, it's not necessarily a title that I'd recommend to just anyone. That's because to get the most out of the film, I think you really need to be a John Wayne fan first and foremost. The movie trades heavily on Wayne's cinematic persona, and it incorporates some autobiographical details that make it even funnier the more you know about him. That said, McClintock has enormous replay value, and it's the kind of good old-fashioned comedy crowd pleaser that never goes out of style.
Yeah, McClintock is, in my estimation, one of the most popular Wayne films among his fans. It's one of the most commonly played on television. It was also in the public domain pretty early for whatever reason, so the copies of it were readily available for a long time. It is an important, even I might say transitional film in Wayne's career for some reasons that you alluded to. Without downplaying the degree to which all Westerns revisit familiar stories, many of Wayne's Westerns, beginning with McClintock and then onward, are in a way variations of earlier, sometimes darker efforts. McClintock, like Chisholm, another film from later in Wayne's career, 1970, McClintock is in a sense an alternative version of 1948's Red River, as if that film had had a sunnier ending and then we find out what happened next. But more relevant, I suppose, for today's episode is how I find that many of Wayne's Westerns from the 60s and 70s share McClintock's overall atmosphere of warmth and good humor. I find McClintock a comforting movie to watch, which stems, I think, from something you observed when we discussed The Undefeated in our Rock Hudson episode, that Wayne is often at his best in these later movies when he himself is laid back and comfortable.
Yeah, I think you're right. He has that ease with him here. You're also right that this movie is beloved by his fans, his hardcore fans, not just Western fans, but John Wayne devotees constantly bring this up online. I see they really love it. They quote it. It's like their version of Animal House or something. I constantly hear them use the same lines over and over again, and they're really good lines. I think Grant's script is a lot of fun. I also really think Wayne maybe got off on having so much of his family around him. And it's wonderful to see Patrick Wayne here having a juicy role for a change. He really steps up. And I mean, earlier than this, he had bit parts in some of his dad's movies, but here he's a full-fledged character, and he acquits himself really well. I've always loved Patrick Wayne. I think he would have been a great Superman. He has got that charisma, got a great smile. So, yeah, it's really a fun family film that way.
Yeah, in terms of having friends and family around him in the production of a film, I don't know if McClintock was ever really topped. I think it's certainly something they tried to top later on. Big Jake is another film that both in terms of cast and crew had a lot of friends and family around. But it certainly is a benchmark in some senses. And that might just explain why it's such a fun movie, that the people involved were clearly having a great time making it. Now, being that both you and I are also horror fans, I have to ask you about the appearance of the great Yvonne De Carlo.
Right.
In the film. She, of course, is probably today best known for playing Lily Munster in the television series of the Munsters. So any thoughts about her performance here as Patrick Wayne's mother and McClintock's, for a brief period, cook?
I adore Lily Munster. I think she's one of the great moms of all time on TV moms. So this was a year before she became one of the Munsters.
Correct.
Yeah, so it's right there. Something about her character, I don't know why they even went with her. They kind of add her to this family, but I don't know. I might have almost rather have seen the Chinese cook continue cooking meals throughout the entire thing. And speaking of the Chinese cook, I mean, there's some humor in this movie, whether it's the Chinese cook or the spankings that we get later on, or the drunk Indian jokes that might rub certain modern viewers the wrong way. But if you roll with them, they seem in good fun. What do you think about Wayne's skills? I'll use that word. I don't know. As a physical comedian, he does some real broad slapstick here, both in the mud pit fight, which is pretty spectacular, and some stairway action. How do you find him as a physical comedian?
I think that there are some limitations to Wayne as an actor. I think where he really excels is as a performer who employs more subtle and minute gestures. And that was certainly a performance style that he was able to cultivate. That's something that Ford encouraged. So when he's doing these broad gestures, so the falling down the stairs gag where Wayne does this thing where he arches his back and he gets an odd expression on his face. He does it both in the stairs and also in the mud pit. It's something you see recurring. It's certainly in Donovan's Reef, for example. To me, there are these moments where I think Wayne kind of pushes it a little bit too far. I mean, maybe I'm not supposed to say that as a Wayne fan, but I think to your point, where he's best as a comedian is in the subtle asides, the reaction shots, which is also his strength as a dramatic actor. The looks that he can give, the way that he can deliver small lines as if he's almost talking to himself. I mean, that's always one of his strengths. So the things that you've observed as being some of the most delightful things about his performance here, to me, are congruent with the way that he performs as a dramatic actor. What do you think of his broad comedy?
I like seeing it. It's different seeing it from him. He doesn't do it that often, but it doesn't hit the same way as some of his lines here. Like, I get such a kick out of this young character, Ben, who we see at one point early on, who challenges McClintock about,
Some of us haven't got all the money in the world. Some of us ain't old and tired and feel like being put upon.
When McClintock starts hearing this young kid challenge him, he just looks at him and he says,
"You interest me, young Ben. Go on."
And we realize, he's about to pop his cork. He's about to go crazy. So, I don't know. I find that kind of comedy works much better for me coming from Wayne than the physical stuff. His acting in this is pretty good. There's a scene he delivers to Stephanie Powers, who plays his daughter Becky, where he tells her why she's basically being disinherited for her own sake. And it's a really effective scene, I think. He spells out his own philosophy on the matter, and she gives a great performance back. That's a really kind of unusual scene in this film. It's not funny at all, and it really works.
Yeah, I like that scene a lot, too. It's really interesting to see a father-daughter scene. I mean, those types of scenes between fathers and sons, usually involving some kind of shooting lesson, for example, so whether biological father or surrogate father, are, of course, almost a dime a dozen in the Western. But to see this extended sequence where a father kind of reveals himself to his daughter and explains his life philosophy and tells her what her life is going to be like, That is an unusual scene. I mean, I suppose Wayne in a way returns to scenes kind of like that at moments in True Grit, but I can't think of another moment, at least in his Western career, where he has this type of moment with a daughter character. I mean, that's very unusual for him.
Are you longing to see a movie with good, clean fun? Do you like to watch a screen full of savage, bloodthirsty, rampaging Indians on the warpath? Does a tender story of family devotion get you right here?
If you're my father, if you love me, you'll shoot him.
Well, I'm your father, and I sure love you. So?
Oh, you shot him!
If so, then McClintock will hit you where you live.
Okay, Andrew, and what is your number 2?
My second film today is The Paleface, released in 1948. Reluctant federal agent Calamity Jane, played by Jane Russell at her absolute deadpan best, is sent to uncover a plot to arm renegade Indians with rifles and dynamite. Wanting to travel incognito, she dupes hapless frontier dentist Painless Peter Potter into marrying her and heading farther west. Potter, played by Bob Hope, is oblivious to his wife's subterfuge and to her repeated interventions that save his life, including one that weirdly anticipates the grand revelation of John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, released over a decade later. As Potter bumbles his way west, he becomes famous despite himself, first as a great Indian fighter, then as a deadly gunslinger. Though intended by original screenwriter Frank Tashlin to be a satire of Owen Wister's The Virginian, the final picture is a much broader parody that places Hope and Russell in a succession of conventional Western scenarios, as members of a wagon train, in a remote cabin besieged by hostile Indians, in a twilight gunfight on the streets of a Western town, as captives in an Indian camp, and so on. Hope adopts his usual screen persona, aptly described by one critic as lecherous, venal, cowardly, and opportunistic, and is given a lot of good material to work with, including some very witty dialogue. Going west in a covered wagon, that's my kind of life. Blazing new frontiers, facing danger, privation, and death. Is that my kind of life? Or my personal favorite, brave men run in my family. Let that one sink in for a minute. The movie's set pieces are also cleverly staged, especially the shootout between Potter and Joe, the town bully. It's a slow, silent affair that, in its staging, pacing, and resolution, recalls the work of Buster Keaton. The movie's climax, which sees Potter and Jane commandeer a wagon full of dynamite and flee from a gang of pursuing cowboys and Indians, is genuinely exciting, balancing Potter's blunderings with a number of daring stunts. Reviews of The Paleface were mixed, with some critics lamenting the absence of Hope's frequent co-stars Bing Crosby and Dorothy Lamour. Audiences didn't mind, though, and The Paleface became one of the biggest hits of 1948. Hope and Russell, who have excellent chemistry, reunited 4 years later for a sequel, Son of Paleface, directed by Tashlin. And Hope and Paleface's director, Norman Z. MacLeod, would re-team for another Western comedy, Alias Jesse James, in 1959. But those are stories for another day.
You are right. Jane Russell is so good in this movie. She was really the secret weapon as far as I'm concerned. The reveal that we first get of her, where in this jail cell where we think there must be this notorious bandit, and we expect to see some hulking presence there, and the camera deliberately pans over to catch who it is, and there's her in there. It's such a great surprise moment. She's so ruthless throughout the film, and yet the way she warms slowly towards Hope's character, they really take that relationship gradually. She doesn't just instantly come over to his side. She, right up until late in the second act or in the beginning of the third act, she's still ready to sell him out at any moment, and we believe it. So yeah, she's just wonderful. She even gets to kill a bunch of people, not just wound them. She racks up a body count in this movie.
Yep. 12, 13, 14, or maybe 15 Indians, depending on who's counting.
Yeah, it's brutal. The one part that I do reach for the fast forward button, though, is, and it's just a personal thing for me, dental humor is really hard for me to sit through, whether it's this movie or Little Shop of Horrors, where Jack Nicholson's getting all his teeth drilled. Something about dental humor just will never work for me. So this movie pushes the boundaries.
Yeah, I've read a number of interviews with Russell, who it seems like didn't enjoy making a lot of the movies she was in, but spoke very highly of this and was actually really happy that a number of early reviewers of the film kind of panned her performance as being kind of one note, which of course was exactly the point. So she seemed to take that in stride and recognize that what they were interpreting as a lack of ability was in fact a great demonstration of restraint, let's say. I also really like that opening moment where we see her buckskin clad in the jail. In a way, the movie, I suppose, could be read as Jane Russell atoning for the sin of Howard Hughes, the outlaw, or something like that.
I wish we had more from Robert Armstrong, who's in the film. He has a small role, and he's almost third billed, I think, in there. And I just adore him from King Kong and Son of Kong, so I was hoping he would have a little bit more to do here, but it could be anybody at that point. It won an Oscar for a song, I think. It's the song that Hope sings in the dental wagon, Buttons and Bows.
Buttons and Bows, yes. So this film did win the Academy Award for Best Original Song. It is a Jay Livingston, Ray Evans composition, Buttons and Bows, which the success of which was helped, no doubt, by a number of popular recordings of the song that were available in 1947 and 48. I think the best known one is by Dinah Shore, whose rendition spent something like 24 weeks on the charts in 47 and 48, peaking at number one. The way it's deployed in the movie, though, is really just brilliant as Potter, serenades his new wife with this lovely little ditty about frontier life and its challenges, let's say.
It shows him at his best. It shows Bob Hope as a song and dance man, an all-around entertainer. He steals those scenes. He's able to work with his prop, that accordion he uses so beautifully. You see why this guy was this vaudeville legend, and that song is really charming in the film. And like you said, too, it looks really good. The Technicolor looks vibrant and really
Hope's
crisp.
first color movie.
Was it really? Oh, wow. Yeah. It shows. It just pops off the screen. It has all these fun little visual tricks throughout it. The text that appears up on screen now and then, that is animated.
Yeah, it's a big Tashlin thing. Yeah.
I love that stuff. It just feels good on your eyes when you're watching this movie.
A western ranch is just a branch of Nowhere Junction to me. Give me the city where living's pretty and the gals wear finery. East is east and west is west and the wrong one I have chose. Let's go where you'll keep on wearing those frills and flowers and buttons and bows, rings and things and buttons and bows.
All right, Matt, over to you for your second choice.
My second comedy western is the raunchy 1984 spoof Lust in the Dust, directed by the great Paul Bartel and written by Philip John Taylor, who cut his teeth writing for sitcoms like Mork and Mindy and Too Close for Comfort. The film tells the torrid story of 300-pound dance hall girl Rosie Velez, who meets a laconic gunfighter named Abel Wood while on her way to the town of Chile Verde. The two eventually arrive at a ramshackle saloon owned by Margarita Ventura, a buxom bordello madam who takes an interest in them. But when Rosie and Abel learn about a fortune in gold that's supposedly buried somewhere in town, greed gets the better of them, and it's not long before guns start blazing. Now, Lust in the Dust was originally conceived by its star, Tab Hunter, as a straightforward western in the Sam Peckinpah tradition. It was going to be called The Reverend and Rosie, and would have paired Hunter with Shirley MacLaine. But after the surprise success of the John Waters film Polyester, which teamed Hunter with drag superstar Divine, the producers convinced him to take a more comedic approach. The result is an awkward mix of slapstick gags and gross-out humor. But there are enough laughs here, along with some genuinely amusing sexual dynamics, that I felt it deserved a spot on our show. The movie was shot in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and features iconic Western star Henry Silva in a very funny supporting role. It even includes cameos from Woody Strode and Pedro Gonzalez Gonzalez, who you might recognize as the chatty hotel owner in Rio Bravo. Tab Hunter's own career began in the Western genre with films like Track of the Cat and The Burning Hills. Unfortunately, he underplays his role here and never seems quite comfortable on screen. Perhaps that's because he and Bartel didn't see eye to eye on this project. Hunter remained fixated on making a violent action western, while Bartel was more interested in directing a melodrama like Duel in the Sun. Interestingly enough, the movie's title, Lust in the Dust, was actually coined on the set of Duel in the Sun. As the story goes, that film's co-star, Joseph Cotten, dismissively referred to it as Lust in the Dust while shooting the picture, and the name was eventually recycled for this movie. Now, I'm an enormous fan of Paul Bartel. His 1975 sci-fi parody Death Race 2000 is one of my all-time favorite movies, and his delicious black comedy Eating Raoul might be the wittiest film ever made about cannibalism. Lust in the Dust is nowhere near as memorable as those two classics, but it's not without its pleasures, and chief among them is the inspired pairing of Divine and Broadway star Lainey Kazan, who plays Margarita. The movie also contains 2 show-stopping musical numbers and a host of bawdy sight gags that test the boundaries of good taste. Although a lot of the jokes fall flat, it hits its mark often enough that I get a kick out of introducing it to first-time viewers. And speaking of bawdy humor, the gimmick with the treasure map being tattooed on the butt cheeks of Divine and Kazan is actually a sly nod to director Antonio Margheriti's 1974 spaghetti western, The Stranger and the Gunfighter. In that film, a treasure map is divided into 4 segments, and each one is tattooed on a beautiful woman's rear end. How's that for a glowing western tribute?
So I had not seen this film before, which is not something I can say about many westerns. As you alluded to, Lust in the Dust quite obviously tries to do to the western what Waters' Polyester did to the family melodrama a few years earlier, offer a campy, subversive satire of a celebrated movie genre. And in my estimation, it fails. I guess. Whereas, Waters' satire demonstrates a deep familiarity or even admiration for the melodramas of Douglas Sirk, which were in their own way just as critical of the suburban society that they were depicting. The knowledge of the Western here strikes me as a little bit more superficial, as does much of the film's humor. I agree, it's nice to see Strode, Gonzalez, and Silva, but I suppose their appearances are kind of a case in point for me that, character names like Black Man and Mexican are supposed to be a comment on the generic quality of supporting ethnic parts in Westerns, but the casting of such beloved actors undercuts the satire, as does the fact that they're given nothing to do. And worse, I think, is Silva, who I was not as, I guess, enamored with his sort of one-note gangster Bernardo character as you were. Silva, as you and I know many of our listeners will know, not only got his start playing Western bad guys in films like The Tall T, The Law, Jake Wade, The Bravados, but it was a role in a spaghetti Western, The Hills Run Red, that launched kind of a second career for him as a leading man in Italian genre pictures. So, like Strode and Gonzalez, the film doesn't do anything with his rich career history and kind of frustratingly gives him little to do other than play the type of generic bad guy that he never, in fact, played in the types of Westerns this film is trying to parody.
Wow, yeah, I like Silva's performance here much more of what they do with him. He cracks me up. This whole period, right around this time, he was doing a lot of weird comedies. He also appears in John Landis's Amazon Women on the Moon, where he spoofs Robert Stack. Something about seeing this terrifying face of his, that he was such a heavy, just camping it up and goofing off. I just love his accent in the film. So that part works for me. I suppose as a lifelong Divine fan, I mean, I've been watching Divine movies since junior high school, when an uncle of mine gave me a copy of Female Trouble on VHS, and I just couldn't believe that this film existed and people actually knew about it. I came to Pink Flamingos way too early, and that just blew my mind. So I've been a Divine fan for a long time, and I find his performance here really good. I really love Divine in this role. He commits to it without winking at the camera, and he still has a little bit of this underground art scene edge to him, where he's slyly commenting on the character and this type of melodramatic character. This is a different role for him. In some of those early Waters films, Divine is often a menacing character, constantly like a terrifying figure. And then now and then Waters would cast him, like in Polyester, as this de-glamorized sad sack. But here he gets to play the sex pot. He's sort of throws himself into it unabashedly. And I think his relationship with Lainie Kazan, every time the two of them are on screen together, I'm really happy with this movie.
Well, I guess it goes without saying that Divine never had a problem committing to any role or any act that a role required, let's say. I think you make a good point, though, about how the kind of monstrous feminine aspect of his persona in those early Waters films that was indeed really threatening softens over the course of his career to the point where in the 1980s, he almost, for lack of a better word, can kind of play it straight in these roles.
Yeah, really.
And which probably says something about, well, I don't know, maybe actually says something nice about society over the course of those 15 or odd years. Something to mull over.
He was preparing to do a follow-up with Tab Hunter. They were going to do another picture after this, and it was going to be called James Blonde. They were going to do a James Bond spoof where Tab Hunter played a Bond character, and Divine was going to play 6 different Bond girls.
Oh my God.
Multiple role, and one of them was named Sue E, and she was a hog farmer. I mean, that might have been pretty good. Here, Paul Bartel came on it right at the last possible second. This was not a project that he originated. They wanted John Waters to direct it, and Waters only directs his own material, so he passed. Bartel maybe wasn't well suited to this material. His films are often very dryly witty, and here it's much, much goofier. But because of Divine's performance and Lainie Kazan, whose song in this film, what's it, South of My Border, her song is really good. I think that song is hilarious. So this picture belongs to the women as far as I'm concerned.
Madre de Dios! What are you doing? Who are you? Where do you come from? I said, who are you? What do you want? It's me, isn't it? You're going to have your filthy way with me under the hot desert sun, aren't you? You're going to ravage me like I've never been ravaged before. Your hot sweat sliding over my body as we roll in the dust. Oh, as you violate my innermost parts. As you pound against me in orgasmic animal passion. Oh, God. You're disgusting.
You people got a strange sense of humor.
Okay, Andrew, and what is your last comedy western?
My third and final comedy western is Support Your Local Sheriff, released in 1969. As some of our listeners know, I wrote a book about westerns between 1969 and 1980. That is, westerns made between 1969 and 1980. I didn't write the book then. And in that book, I devoted no more than 6 sentences to Blazing Saddles, despite the fact that it was the most popular western of that period and earned, as I said earlier, more money than any western in history to that point. Only one of those 6 sentences offered anything approaching an evaluation of the film. To wit, on re-examination, Mel Brooks' western farce is mediocre and ham-fisted. I stand by this statement. To be fair, if I had to do it over, I would probably write a little bit more about Blazing Saddles, if only to expand on how much I dislike it. I might, for example, express my frustration at how the movie's reputation as best Western comedy diverts attention from the many better Western comedies released ever, but especially around the same time, including what I consider to be the greatest Western comedy ever made, Support Your Local Sheriff. The difference between Support Your Local Sheriff and Blazing Saddles is best conveyed with the old adage, There's a difference between laughing with and laughing at. Rather than take cheap shots at the Western, Support Your Local Sheriff invites viewers to laugh along with it as it sends up familiar characters and tropes. James Garner, who also produced, stars as Jason McCullough, a skilled gunman who, en route to Australia, accepts the position of sheriff in a nascent, unruly mining town called Callender in Colorado. Enlisting the town drunk Jake as his deputy, McCullough promptly arrests local tough Joe Danby for murder, setting in motion events that lead to a final showdown with the entire Danby extended family. Some of the famous westerns gently parodied over the course of the movie include High Noon, Shane, Rio Bravo, and especially My Darling Clementine, as no less than Walter Brennan himself plays Danby patriarch Pa, a role more than a little reminiscent of his turn in Clementine as the villainous Old Man Clanton. Support Your Local Sheriff was directed by Burt Kennedy and written and produced by William Bowers, two men who knew a thing or two about westerns. Bowers devised the premise and co-wrote the screenplay for The Gunfighter, a story we told in our April 2020 episode about that film. He earned an Academy Award nomination for that screenplay and was nominated again 8 years later for the comedy western The Sheepman, co-written with James Edward Grant. Bowers also co-wrote the aforementioned Alias Jesse James. Kennedy wrote some of the best westerns of the 50s, including 7 Men from Now and The Tall T. In 1961, he turned his attention to directing and went on to become the most prolific Western filmmaker of the 1960s and 70s, with a filmography that includes The Magnificent Seven sequel, Return of the Seven, the John Wayne picture The War Wagon, Welcome to Hard Times, Annie Calder, and The Train Robbers, another Wayne picture. Much of the appeal of Support Your Local Sheriff is down to the charming performance of Gardner, who had honed the persona of the laconic Western hero on the first 3 seasons of the television series Maverick. Just as worthy of praise, though, are Jack Elam as McCullough's reluctant deputy and Joan Hackett as the hot-tempered mining heiress Prudy Perkins. Hackett proves more than a match for Garner, holding her own in verbal repartee and demonstrating some serious physical comedy chops. Elam, meanwhile, is just hilarious. His delivery of the line, "Take it easy, boys. Me and the sheriff takes a dim view of show-offs with guns," as he awkwardly backs out of the saloon, guns drawn, is quite possibly the funniest thing I've ever seen and heard. I have to pause the movie at this point every time to give myself a moment to recover. Support Your Local Sheriff was a modest hit in 1969 and was, by most accounts, a fun movie to make. So much so that Kennedy, Garner, and most of the rest of the cast reunited 2 years later for another Western comedy, Support Your Local Gunfighter. But that's a story for another day.
Well, I like Blazing Saddles more than you do, although I like that you don't. That's really great. I'd say I'm about equal on these two movies. I think the cast of Blazing Saddles will never be topped. Those performances are stellar. Madeline Kahn is on next level, and Gene Wilder is just in his own stratosphere. But Garner could not be more charming in this movie. He's just so effortlessly cool, so laid back. He seems as though he's walked in from another movie and kind of has heard of Westerns and seen a few, so he knows what the tropes are. And he's just wryly commenting on them and kind of going along with them. He's such a wonderful devil-may-care character. I never get tired of watching him. He also has, it must be said, I mean, I'm sure it's been said before, the greatest jawline in cinema history. His lower jaw, I mean, it looks like a piece of construction equipment. It's so powerful looking. And he's used to great effect here. I think Burt Kennedy knows exactly how to direct James Garner.
Yeah, it's interesting because when Garner left Maverick, he did so with the intention never to make another Western, and yet could not pass up the opportunity to not only star in, but produce this film, and would go on to make other Westerns, not only Support Your Local Gunfighter, but some Italian Westerns, as well as a few others. Would return to the Maverick role later in his life opposite Mel Gibson. So he is one of these interesting younger actors associated with the Western who, emerges out of television at this time. Burt Reynolds would be another one, I suppose, a kind of comparable actor who comes out of TV Westerns around this time and has a good feature film career. I like your description of him as having walked in from another movie, with all the skills of a gunfighter, but vaguely aware of the genre's conventions. I think that is, in a sense, what this script does.
Yeah, and Elam, you could not have been more correct about him. I think it was back in it was on our Kirk Douglas episode where I mentioned for The Way West that Jack Elam shows up in a small role and how much I love Jack Elam. This is the movie for him. This and Cannonball Run are his two greatest performances. He's often thought of just as this goofy looking character because he has such an unforgettable look. But man, is his timing and his delivery of a line here so perfect. You see so much more going on here when you watch him. You can see he's not just being used for his appearance sake. He can pause on a line and just quizzically think for a second and crack you up just by the look on his face. He's so wonderful in this role. One of the things that Burt Kennedy is obviously known for are the brawls in his films. He's the master, along with Hal Needham and guys like that, at really just doing an all-out brawl. And the one we get here in the mud is really a fun one. What's interesting is we've had two big mud fights on their show so far. McClintock has this massive mud fight with people sliding down this mudslide. That one's more of a white clay kind of mud, and this film has the traditional brown, heavy mud. They're just wonderful go for broke moments. And both Andrew V. McLaughlin and Burt Kennedy know how to do a great all-out brawl.
Well, and it's interesting that in Support Your Local Sheriff, it's Prudy who, instigates that brawl, which ultimately leads to McCullough's kind of introduction to the community as he promptly orders the fire brigade to start pumping the fire wagon, and he hoses everyone off. One other thing I might say about Hackett is that this is not her first Western. She was in Will Penny opposite Charlton Heston a couple of years earlier, which is a really interesting study in contrast because that is a very kind of melancholy, sad film where she plays, in some ways, a similar kind of frontier character, but a different one. So those two films back to back give a really good indication of her range. And it kind of makes me sad that there weren't more opportunities for her to make Westerns over the course of her career.
His name is Jason McCullough, and he alone holds the answers to Calendar's problems. The rock. Or the rope. Or, when everything else fails, the finger.
He stuck his finger in the end of your what?
All Jason needs is the town's support and the love of a good woman. James Garner, Joan Hackett, Walter Brennan, Harry Morgan, Jack Elam. Support your local sheriff.
That's it for me for today, Matt. What is your third and final film?
My third and final film is the 1998 Western explorer comedy, Almost Heroes. It's a guilty pleasure of mine, emphasis on the word guilty, and was directed by Christopher Guest and stars Chris Farley and Matthew Perry. Now, people often confuse Almost Heroes with the 1994 comedy Wagons East, starring John Candy and Richard Lewis, and it's not hard to see why. Both films were released within just a few years of each other, and both feature the final performance of a larger-than-life comedy legend. But for my money, Almost Heroes is the funnier of the two pictures, and credit for that goes squarely to Chris Farley. Set in 1804, the film casts Farley as Bartholomew Hunt, an oafish tracker who's hired by a fussy aristocrat to lead an expedition across the United States to the Pacific Northwest. Their goal is to beat Lewis and Clark to the punch, and thus earn a place in history. Written by a trio of sitcom writers and shot in the fall of 1996, the movie was scheduled for release the following year, but was delayed for an additional year because of a studio business merger. Sadly, when it finally arrived in theaters, Farley, who was only 33 years old at the time, had passed away from an accidental drug overdose. Now, Almost Heroes is definitely not a movie for everyone, but there are several scenes throughout this film that make me laugh so hard I simply couldn't bring myself not to include it here on the show. Although it's nowhere near as great as the Chris Farley classic Tommy Boy, I prefer Almost Heroes to both Black Sheep and Beverly Hills Ninja. And if that's not high praise, then I don't know what is. I especially love the moment where Farley warns his fellow explorers about the horrifying animals they'll encounter on their voyage. From hawks that swoop down and pull your eyes out, to bears that split people in half with their teeth, to badgers with paws as big as frying pans, Farley's animal descriptions are some of the funniest moments in the movie. And then there's the heartwarming scene where Matthew Perry unleashes Farley's imagination by teaching him to read. Of course, he only gets as far as introducing the concept of the lowercase letter A before Farley's head almost explodes. Now, as funny as those scenes are, the film is probably best remembered for a running gag where Farley attempts to steal an eagle's egg from a nest. It's a truly hilarious sequence that shows just what a gifted physical comedian he was. As for Matthew Perry, well, he's not one of my favorite comic actors, and the truth is, I tend to find his shtick fairly annoying most of the time. But he's actually not too smarmy in this movie, which I do appreciate. Now, despite having a whopping budget of $30 million, Almost Heroes has all the visual panache of a junior high school film production. Likewise, the editing is sloppy and haphazard, the score is less than evocative, and the costumes look like somebody might have borrowed them from a Spirit Halloween costume shop. And yet, in virtually every one of his scenes, Chris Farley makes up for that with some very big laughs. Few performers, to my mind, devoured the scenery with as much gusto as he did. Farley was, of course, a famously troubled soul. By all accounts, a warm and lovable figure. His self-destructive tendencies and his history of addiction took a major toll on his health. At the time of his death, he was about to make the leap to drama with a biopic of controversial silent film star Fatty Arbuckle. It was the kind of project that might have earned him serious respect from critics who often treated him like a buffoon rather than the talented comedian he was. As for Almost Heroes, well, it was a box office flop. And that's a real shame because if it had been a bigger hit, we might have gotten the sequel, where Farley and his fellow explorers walk to Asia, as they literally set out to do at the end of this movie.
I had not seen Almost Heroes since 1998, and I'm actually glad that I revisited it for all the reasons that you said, Matt. It does include some genuinely funny laughs. Some of it is quite clever, but it's interesting to revisit both for maybe why it failed, but also how it's, I don't know, kind of an example of a type of comedy that isn't made anymore. And maybe I'll start there. It strikes me that comedies like this, so, a period comedy, in a sense, doesn't get made and released to cinemas anymore. It seems like the type of thing that Adam Sandler would make as part of his Netflix deal in between the more serious films that he undertakes, The Ridiculous Six being an example of that. And that, in a way, makes me sad that there isn't a space in cinemas for this type of comedy anymore.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this feels like just a loose collection of SNL sketches that are sort of crammed together, and it kind of has that feeling to it. And we don't see that as often, definitely not on the screen, like you said. I mean, there's a lot of movies that we don't see anymore on the screen, everything from courtroom dramas to, all kinds of detective films. We just don't get those on screen anymore. We just get spectacle after spectacle. So I do kind of miss these Police Academy style silly romps. I mean, I'm a big Police Academy fan. So this movie isn't Blazing Saddles. Of course, it's probably closer to something like Robin Hood Men in Tights, this kind of like broad visual gags. But time and time again, Farley, he's really he's obviously the star of the film, but he's the only reason this movie is remembered in any way. Yeah.
Well, in terms of, what this film was trying to be in researching it, actually researched it for this episode. We came across interviews with the producer, Denise Denovi, and her sort of recurring explanation for why the movie failed, despite the fact that it had Christopher Guest directing it, despite the fact that it had this really good cast, was that it wasn't really able to meld this kind of uneasy combination of what was intended to be, at least in her view, a Blackadder-style historical comedy, kind of dry, dark satire, with the kinetic, physical humor of Chris Farley. And I'd also read that during the film's post-production, that a lot of that editing, maybe the editing that you referred to, was cutting out a lot of the other character interactions and trying to winnow the film down to really showcase those moments from Farley. What do you think of that explanation for why the film didn't land?
It's definitely part of it. It does feel sort of unfinished in a way. Characters literally are in one shot, and then later on they're not in that shot anymore. They just magically vanish because things change a lot. So it could have contributed to it. I think box office wise, whenever your movie comes out and the main star is dead already in real life, it's never going to survive that in a way, especially a movie that's supposed to try to make people feel good by laughing. It just has this pall hanging over it that just feels like doom. And he doesn't look very healthy at times in this film, which is a shame. But for a guy that big who is having so many physical issues, and one of the things that I love watching him in this film is he's kind of light on his feet. He's for such an enormous guy, he moves with a sort of grace that we can see throughout this film, especially when he's doing some of the pratfalls and things. He really just throws his body into this movie.
People said almost the exact thing about Roscoe Arbuckle, so it's not a surprise that he would have been tapped to play that comedian. Yeah, it's really kind of one of those what ifs of film history. Certainly we saw what happened to Jim Carrey after he took on the role of another famous comedian. I guess we can only wonder what would have happened to Farley. There are moments in this film where he does demonstrate something approaching a more dramatic register. There are some moments where, and this is something that comes up occasionally, especially in Tommy Boy, where we do get some genuine moments that see him drop the kind of ultra kinetic performance mode and do something a little bit more serious. Clearly that was something people saw at the time. It's just a shame we didn't get to see more of it.
His character is, at times he seems like they're playing, like they haven't figured out what to do with him. At times he seems like he's an idiot and doesn't understand anything. And then other times he's much smarter than anybody else around him. So it's an uneasy character. They haven't quite nailed down what works here. Well, when you mentioned Arbuckle, he has an uncredited role in Go West, playing a woman.
In an elevator, yes.
And here's Farley, who's going to be playing him if he hadn't died. And we already had a man playing a woman in Lust in the Dust. Yeah. So there's sort of something's going on here. I don't know what's going on.
The universe is telling us something. And if any listener can figure out what that is, send us an email.
Fear will be our breakfast and stark raving terror our daily luncheon. Hey, Mr. Hunt.
I'd be more worried about the Indians than the bears. It's common knowledge that when the savages capture a white man, they will split open his head, pick out his brains, and eat them with a crudely fashioned fork. So...
Have you witnessed such atrocities, Mr. Hunt?
I've seen the forks.
Well, that about wraps up our Comedy Western episode. But before we let you go, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Western Podcast. That's at, as in the at symbol, Western Podcast, all one word. Tell us about your favorite funny Western, and you just might hear us discuss it on a future show. Also, if you enjoy our podcast and want to help support it, the best way you can do that is by subscribing to it on whatever platform you use. And with that said, until next time, I'm Matthew Chernov.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson. And you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.